Hello, and welcome to Ctrl Alt Lead, the podcast from computing where we talk to IT leaders at the sharp edge of technology and leadership. My guest today is known globally as the Tech Humanist and has spent her career helping leaders navigate AI ethics, responsible tech, and human-centric digital transformation. Kate O'Neill, welcome to Ctrl Alt Lead.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here, Penny.
And thank you so much for joining us. So, Kate, your specialist subject is essentially helping companies to innovate with emerging technologies, but in a way that benefits both their business, but also broader humanity. Is that right?
That's right. And I find that a lot of leaders feel hamstrung by the complexity of the decisions that they face these days. Increasingly, as AI enters more and more of those decisions, as big data is more and more the composition of it. And they think, they understand how to make decisions that benefit the business, but they do understand that there are broader and deeper consequences to these decisions than there have ever been. And so that's where I find myself advising leaders these days.
There's a tendency to frame AI at the moment, especially in the media, as a race. But for the people listening and watching who are building these systems, to me, it seems as much of a question of their judgment under a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of competing incentives, and nobody knows what the long-term consequences of any of this are going to be. Do you think the terminology around AI races is helpful?
I don't think it's helpful. I think that it is not inaccurate in the sense that, we certainly observe the models in a race, right? Like we see the AI development companies, the OpenAI, Anthropic, these companies out here competing with one another for even just one day's leg up on each other, right? You see that happening again and again where it's like, oh, now they have a 4.7, now they have 4.8. And it does feel insanely competitive, and it feels very, very challenging for anyone to really keep up with. And I think for the executive leaders, certainly for your listeners who are thinking about this in their own environments and their own decision making, it can feel like that race is infecting the decisions that they have to make, and that they're getting increasingly left behind, and that things are, on this fast track. And I think that does muddy the complexity of those decisions, because I think the decisions themselves need to be undertaken in a sustainable sort of way. We need to be thinking responsibly about the types of decisions we make with such powerful tools. And right now, I think it's not so much the capability of AI, it's the governance lag that we have, and the misaligned incentives and the asymmetry of power. So there's a few places in which we just don't have the right mechanisms, the right tools, the right models, the right frameworks to make these decisions well. And that's putting a lot of pressure on leaders.
And you've got this massive sort of FOMO, essentially, haven't you, underpinning that whole very unstable mix.
Exactly. Because I think rightly, I think a lot of leaders feel that they do need to be, thinking about how to move along and get these things kind of accelerating their businesses. But I think there's a both and there. One is you do need to be thinking about how to have kind of an innovative experimental approach to just kind of figuring out what could AI do for your organization. But that can't lead the strategy of how you're using AI. I think, one of the things I've been saying for many years is that the biggest mistake that leaders make around digital transformation is thinking that technology dictates that transformation. It should never be led by technology. It should always be led by your own purpose and strategy and what it is you're trying to do as an organization. But again, there's that both and, right? You do want to have an understanding of the capability and what it can do for you. And when you do eventually figure out how do we roll this in a meaningful way, in a way that actually does bring alignment to what we're trying to do and what customers expect of us and what the marketplace expects of us, and so on.
I'd like to dig a little into, you mentioned it earlier, into the asymmetry
Hmm.
at the moment that we seem to be in. When you look at how generative AI in particular is being developed and deployed, the incentives driving the companies themselves and the incentives that are driving governments, their need to regulate, and the incentives that are driving the AI purveyors themselves, all of these incentives seem, there seems to be a mismatch. Where do you see the biggest kind of gaps in alignment, and what risks does that create at a global level? It's quite a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is a big question, but it's fair that it's such a big question because I think it does have those kind of sprawling edges. There's a sense that I think these tools create an algorithmic model that is a new kind of diplomacy, right? I think at the international geopolitical level, we're talking about new ways that AI has enabled an algorithmic intelligence has enabled a different set of narratives across borders and across decision making. It's rarely autonomous. More often, it's human intent that has been laundered through systems. And that's one of the factors that changes, the way that AI and algorithms show up at the most sort of geopolitically macro kind of picture and the way that influences our lives. And then I think that leaders of companies and organizations who are kind of a level down from that level of abstraction are feeling the pinch of needing to scale and needing to feel like we just talked about competitive with this kind of race perception. And that is leading to these kind of outsourced consequences or outscale consequences that are coming back to bite in some cases. People who have rushed ahead of their understanding of what was going to scale with these decisions. And so users and customers end up having pushback. Employee base has pushback to how these things get used. In fact, whole communities sometimes have pushback to how these tools and systems are getting used. And in between those levels, I think we also have this kind of this interplay of things like data centers and other types of sort of public-private types of decisions and topics that are changing the kinds of discourse that decision makers at all levels need to be involved in. It's a really complicated, again, like I think your question is necessarily complex because this is a necessarily complex situation.
You mentioned data centers there,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly there was something my colleagues and I covered it actually in our end of year sort of discussion last year, that there seems to have been a really big jump in public awareness of what a data center even is,
Mm-hmm.
why they don't want to be living in the kind of reasonably close proximity to one, and the environmental impact that they make. Do you think that's so? I mean, I think in the US, there's been a couple of quite significant climb downs recently by some very big companies, haven't they? There's one in
Mm-hmm.
Texas, I think one in Pennsylvania. I forget which, if it was OpenAI. I'm curious to see, is that something that you think is starting to have a bigger influence on the debate, on the discussion?
I do. I think that the media coverage that has some very good media coverage has been expository in just the right ways, and you have books like Karen Howe's Empire of AI. You have a number of entrants into the public discourse that have begun to shape the narrative and begun to gather some momentum from the masses, and that is, I think, changing how that discussion plays out. But I don't think that it's going to materially alter the sort of the direction of this process. I think we're still going to see an awful lot of these data centers. They have to roll out, and I think that the leaders of tech companies and the leaders of consumers of this data powered tech are they realize they need it in order to scale the way they want to scale. And I think that means that there's going to be more of an effort to keep some of these things sort of below the radar and try to keep them out of the public eye. So
Interesting.
I think we're about to find ourselves at a place where the transparency will probably go down, even though we're all now a little more informed than we were, a year ago about what some of these projects look like. So yeah, I think it alters the way this will play out, but I don't think that we're going to see a decrease in appetite for these data centers.
Okay. But not for the people living close to them.
No, the people living close to them are going to be increasingly vocal, I think, about this, and hopefully better informed, and maybe there will be an increasing effort to sort of create grassroots momentum around how to empower people who are living in these communities that are affected by, water issues and the lack of access to jobs.
So communities, there has to be something in it for them. But actually, you can argue that that applies to AI more broadly, that
Yeah.
there are still a lot of individuals out there as acting in their capacity as employees or what have you, that are just like, well, they can't quite see what's in it for them. And that's something that the people who are selling it, I think, are going to have to communicate better.
Yeah, I think it has become something that I've witnessed, and I'm sure you have as well. In the last few months, there's been an increasing call for a sort of a public reckoning with AI and what it means. And I think it's an interesting movement, but it is one that seems to lack some nuance around what kind of AI we're even talking about. Certainly, a lot of this has to do with generative AI. Um, and large language models in specific that have been, sort of front and center in the AI awareness that people have had. But they're not the only form of AI, as I think most of your listeners probably are aware. There's an enormous range of technologies that fall under the umbrella of
Indeed.
AI, and I think we run the risk of painting them all with the same brush. And there's so many that I think still have an incredible opportunity to further human progress. There's a lot of opportunity to align some of the less energy gobbling, but more solution oriented technologies that have more to do with machine learning and pattern recognition and things like helping expedite ocean plastics cleanup and aligning solar panels and wind arrays and things like that. Incredible opportunities to do large scale projects that benefit humanity. And I'd hate personally to see all of that be swept away in the public discourse as just AI is bad. So I think we are desperately in need of more nuance and more education at all levels of how this plays out in society, in leadership, in the public, in the media, and so on.
We need more nuance, I think, is probably a message
Yeah,
for the ages, isn't there?
yeah, yeah.
We've deviated slightly, but that was a really interesting conversation. Thank you. For tech leaders who are making decisions about this technology today, they're having a hard time because obviously they have to consider, what's safe enough, what their responsibilities are, what's strategically necessary. In the face of that uncertainty, what does good judgment on their part look like?
So I introduced a model in my latest book, What Matters Next, called the Now Next Continuum. And it is really just a timeline, that plots past to present to future. But when we look at our decisions along that timeline, what it allows us to do is understand that there are things that we can see with the benefit of hindsight. There are things that we can understand with the benefit of insight, looking at kind of where we are right now. And there are things that we can see with the benefit of foresight. And when we put those kinds of questions about, how to use AI in a meaningful way that benefits our business and keeps human experiences front and center, we can better understand the timing and the scale and the consequence by thinking about it across this timeline, by thinking about what do we understand from past decisions and past experiences that maybe we've seen where we jumped ahead too fast or we lagged too far behind. And then we can look ahead and see, kind of thinking about where we see trends going, where we see, some of the directional indicators that, maybe some things like, autonomous vehicles or whatever might be changing in the public awareness. We understand those things. And so we have to try to time and understand where to invest our efforts relative to that. And that puts us in a position where I think it starts to become a little wiser, a little more circumspect, and able to harness more of an organizational intelligence to be able to make those decisions in the right timing and at the right scale.
So you have some organizations who are optimizing for speed and sort of
Mm.
first mover advantage, and others are deliberately moving at a much slower pace to build that greater control and greater oversight. How should we think about that trade-off? What I'm trying to get to here is whether moving fast actually increases a long-term risk rather than a shorter-term competitive advantage. But equally, there's a risk to not doing it, isn't there? There's a risk to waiting. So it's really difficult to measure, isn't it?
It is difficult to measure, but I think a lot of this again comes back to that now next continuum, because when we do understand that we do have enough information to make a meaningful decision, then we're at the right point to be able to move forward. But if we move ahead of having that information, then we run the risk of what I call the harms of action. And the converse of that is lagging behind when we know we should move, and then we're invoking the harms of inaction. So there is this kind of counterbalance, and we see it all the time in other companies we can witness in the landscape around us, making decisions that to us, to our eyes, maybe feel a little too accelerationist, a little too fast. And that we can witness and sort of say, like, well, they don't understand what the consequences of that are going to be, or they're saying, damn the consequences, we're going to go ahead and rush into this. That looks a little like some of the techno-optimist solutions we see coming out of Silicon Valley sometimes. It can look like other types of things that are moving ahead of any kind of governance or regulation or public understanding of what the consequences are going to be. And on the flip side, I think a lot of times companies feel hesitant to make a decision because they just don't know, which platform is going to be dominant 6 months to a year from now. Which of these is going to be the right approach? How should I make my team ready for the way we're going to roll out this kind of AI? And then they lag and they lag and then they fall behind. And that can actually lead to damage that can't be recovered from for the company and its product. So there definitely is a sort of timing issue there. And again, it comes down to really trying to understand, do you have enough of an insight into the consequences of the decision, whether you move now or don't? And I talk about this again in What Matters Next, and come to this point where I think if you are able to articulate through insights and foresights the decisions that you're making, you're able to be in a place that I call an ethical accelerationist. You can still accelerate, but you can do it in a more sustainable, ethical way.
Have you seen any examples of companies making mistakes when they try to operationalize these ethics?
I've seen examples where I think the intent is to become more nimble as an organization, more scalable and sustainable, but it inevitably requires, thinking about rolling out something like conversational AI in the customer support center or something like that. There's a type of leader, and this type of leader is thinking about numbers only and not human impacts, that is going to say, what, we can cut 15,000 head count from the customer support center by rolling out conversational AI. Let's do it today. And they're not thinking about, not only the impact of those jobs lost in those communities and in those families and for those people, but also of how that impacts the morale of people who are still in the organization, how that impacts the sense of existential risk that people feel about their jobs, how that impacts institutional knowledge and culture for the company, and the preservation of any sense of context or history in decisions that have been made. So these kinds of things are a lot more delicate than what it might appear when someone is just sizing up by metrics and numbers and saying, we could save X number of dollars this year if we roll out chatbots and, fire all of our customer support people. And that ends up being the case that, what we see again and again is that out of those 15,000 people who are let go, a good 5 to 10,000 people of them are brought back over the next 12 months because they weren't ready, right? They weren't ready for that decision. And that's a lot of thrash and a lot of chaos to cause in your organization. It's expensive and it costs you trust within your organization as well. So those are the kinds of things that I would love to see leaders be more circumspect about, more responsible about, and choose the right timing and the right approach instead.
That sort of answers a bit of my closing question, which was going to be, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. If we try to look sort of between 3 and 5 years down the road, which is a very long time, I appreciate.
These days, right?
Yes, 3 weeks would be a struggle. Maybe. But what do you think is going to separate the organizations that are implementing properly generative AI technologies with the right kind of governance and with the right ethics? What's going to separate those organizations from those that perhaps struggle or create unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think this looks like, the fact that leaders really want certainty. It's inevitable. I think humans in general want certainty, right? Like we all do. And that's not how reality works, as we know. Reality instead offers us probabilities, and we have to become conversant in probabilities. Now, luckily, AI is really good at probabilities. It's entirely based on probabilistic math. And we're really good at improbability. So what it behooves us to do is to learn to harness our own human instinct and our wisdom in conjunction with the probabilistic math of AI and learn how to make that into incredible decision making. So it's not about predicting the future, it's about deploying a kind of decision making that is wise and that stays wise even when the future surprises you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. That brings us to the end of this episode of Ctrl Alt Lead. Kate, thank you very much for helping us think a little more clearly about some of what's at stake and for bringing nuance to your conversation that's often reduced to fear-mongering and headline chasing.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Ctrl Alt Lead. If this episode got you thinking, please share it with a friend or a colleague and like and subscribe. You can also check out computing.co.uk for lots of news, features and analysis. Goodbye for now.